You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome to The Paradox. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Larson. Thank you for joining me as we explore the U.S. medical system in a fun, informative format where you can learn about what physicians face through expert analysis. Today I'm going to break my rule a little bit, and then instead of having another physician, I'm going to have Mr. Michael DeVine. He's a licensed counselor, and we're going to be talking about mental health and the problems within the industry. I think you'll find it very informative, certainly at the end with some really interesting answers to questions of how things have changed just in his practice and that he's noticed over the last decade. But a little bit of housekeeping to take care of first. First, a shout out to my new patron, Eric Roberts, who's in medical school. Thanks so much, Eric. It's been fun connecting with you. Next, I'd like to thank each and every one of you who listens to the show and shares this with your friends and colleagues and family members. This last week, maybe it was even a little earlier, but I think it's sometime before I release episode 38, I crossed the 25,000 download mark. I think when I launched the podcast less than a year ago, back in, I think it was April, I don't know exactly what I had thought of target for goals, but I think I'd hoped for about 100 downloads per episode when I looked at the average number of downloads that people receive. I'm not anyone famous, and so I certainly didn't have name recognition to help boost the start of the program or have the ability to get the high-powered guests that lots of these shows get. So it's really been through you, and hopefully we've formed a great relationship. It's been meant a lot to me. This show has allowed me the opportunity to express myself in ways I didn't expect, to hopefully advocate for physicians and for patients, and to help people learn about what's going on. So thank you again, and please, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Of course, it's free. Please recommend it and continue sharing with your friends, and the growth of the show is clearly dependent totally on you, and so I really appreciate that a ton. I can't tell you how much it means to know that people are listening, and so it's pretty cool. And I would also recommend that if you've ever thought about doing your own podcast, go for it, and try and add a unique voice to the airwaves. There's probably something that you are very knowledgeable about, or maybe you have some opinions, maybe you're funny, I don't know. But anyway, I think it's an opportunity to start a conversation, and that's kind of what we're looking at for this show. And certainly with this episode today, where I talked to Michael DeVine, these are two sort of parallel, sometimes intersecting fields. Mental health is obviously always present within the healthcare industry in general, but it's always seen as sort of its own thing on many levels. And so it's an opportunity for us to get together, I guess, and offer insights into how each of our industries works. And it's always funny saying industry because, we don't produce anything. We don't put together cars or televisions. But it is an industry, right? It's when you look at large healthcare systems, and the mental health system is its own thing. And they obviously are symbiotic, and they can help and hurt each other. And so today's just a conversation between us where we try and understand a little bit more about those guys in mental health. The show notes, they'll be found at theparadox.com/039. There you can also find a link to my appearance on Michael's show, the Gray Matters Radio podcast, which was a couple weeks ago. I think it's just a general discussion about healthcare, the problems, which many of them we've discussed today. It's an interesting discussion because not only is Michael coming from the counseling background, but his friend is sort of the everyday guy who is the one dealing with the system. He's your patient. And his father was in purchasing for hospitals. And so he has an interesting perspective as far as how the purchasing process works, the motivations from hospitals and large systems to try and run things efficiently within a large healthcare system. But anyway, without further ado, Mr. Michael DeVine and a discussion about mental health. Enjoy. Well, hey, I'm here with my friend Michael DeVine. He's a licensed professional counselor and family business consultant with a bachelor's in psychology from Otterbein College and a master's degree in psychology from the University of North Texas. I was on Michael's show about 3 weeks ago, I think, Gray Matters Radio, which is a podcast, and he talks about the mind, of course, as a counselor. He's also the author of a book, Failure to Launch, Guidance Clinicians to Launch the Long Dependent Adult Child. He's also a co-host of the Voice Radio Center, the Radical Center, on Talk 1370. He spent the majority of his career in private practice working with families, teens, and young adults with a variety of issues, such as addiction, failure to launch, anxiety, career indecision, autism, and depression, as well as helping guide family-owned businesses to continued and long-term success. So, Michael, thank you so much for returning the favor and coming on my show.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm real excited to be on yours.
I thought it was very magnanimous of me to bring you on since you're in Ohio and I'm in Michigan, but I just was...
Well, this could be perfect.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're both Midwestern. It's interesting. My wife is from Iowa, and when we met in medical school, not University of Iowa, and I would explain to her that, I'm from the Midwest, and she looked at me like I had two heads, and she's like, Michigan's not the Midwest. And her definition was anything west of the Mississippi, I think. And so I'd never thought of it before, but I'm like, I don't know what we are, but we're certainly not the East. So I don't know.
I remember in school, they're trying to explain why the Midwest is the Midwest. And honestly, I think I understood neuroanatomy better than I understood why the Midwest is the Midwest. I really have no clue still.
It's also really gigantic, right? If you use my definition, it's like half the states. It's from Kentucky all the way over out to maybe the edge of Colorado, and then you hit the West, I guess. So today we're going to talk about mental health, which is what you live in most days, and it's a gigantic topic. I listened to your show a couple weeks ago, where I think you exposed some of the underside of the rock of mental health counseling, and to talk about the industry or the profession, I guess. It's what I do all the time on this show, talking about healthcare. We talk about all the warts. We often talk about the solutions to lots of problems as well. But we haven't talked about mental health outside of the epidemic of physician suicide, which we're not going to address today. But why don't you talk to me and just tell me a little bit what you think mental health is? I mean, it's a broad term, so what does it mean to you?
That's actually a good question. I think you almost kind of have to break it down into almost subsets of populations that you're working with, because you have the outpatient providers like myself who are doing traditional counseling, whether it be, working with families, working with individuals, even getting into more of the life career coaching element. And so it's more of the, my background's in counseling psychology, which is more normal ends of the spectrum of mental health issues, where really it's more just about normal people going through difficult times. Mm-hmm. Then we start getting more into the clinical kind of realm, where that can be on an outpatient basis, but I think sometimes the modality and the ways in which you work are a little bit different. But once again, mostly in that outpatient kind of basis. But then you start kind of getting into more the severe mental illness or the chronic and long term, and I think this is where we're having, most of the problems with mental illness and mental health treatment. So we have the chemical dependency treatment. So addiction, which can be the realm of intense and outpatient programs. Basically, they go 3 days a week for, 9 to 5. Mm-hmm. We have acute inpatient, where a lot of times it's 3 to 5 day detox, 3 to 5 day psych evals. We have residential treatment, which goes anywhere from 30 to 90 days. And then we even have what we call the aftercare programs, where transitional living, sober living. And then, of course, we have all stops in between with medication management and testing. And so that's a good, broad range of what we would consider mental health treatment.
And so, when you hear people talking in the media, about mental health, I think oftentimes they're talking about the inpatient portion, or the person who comes in with untreated psychosis or schizophrenia or depression or severe chemical dependency causing all sorts of problems in their life. And they're not talking about the outpatient what you deal with, I suppose. And as bad as and as messed up as healthcare is, pretty much everyone agrees that mental health is even worse. That's where, when it comes to the lack of beds, the lack of psychiatrists, the lack of the intensive treatment available for people, mental health is where the real crisis is. I talked to any of my friends who are emergency room physicians, and all they talk about is how they have holding for 48 hours. These teens who come in, they can't get the rights to commit them because their parents won't agree, or all sorts of other problems. Now, that's not what you deal with, but would you agree that that's the worst crisis right now, or do you think there are mental health problems that you're talking about in your show with the outpatient and the insurance payments and the treatment? Is that worse?
Oh man,
or is that impossible to answer?
It can be all the above, to be honest. I think like when it comes down to outpatient like therapy, I think we've done a really good job of being what we call scientist practitioners, really looking at empirically validated treatments to kind of help people, especially with certain populations, anxiety, depression. We're starting, I think, where a lot of the crises are really, I think, arising is kind of like twofold. I think affordability and the economics, provider supply side of it is one big thing. But I also think it's from a treatment modality for more of these severe mental illnesses where I think the problem is. I mean, being a doctor, imagine if the best treatments you had were maybe 80% effective. You wouldn't feel very good about that. And I think that's the reality of where we're at, especially with addiction. It's all we keep talking about is the addiction problem. And between the modalities that we're using, I mean, if we're really looking at 12 steps programs, the traditional 3 to 5 day detoxes, residential treatment for the worst drugs and the biggest problems we have with heroin and methamphetamine use, I mean, the relapse rates are 85, 90%, and it hasn't really gotten any better. And even with AA, NA, 12-step programs, and it really only, I mean, even though they don't keep internal metrics of what works and what doesn't, you talk with anyone who's been in a 12-step group, you're going to look around a room of 20 people, maybe 4 or 5 people have a sobriety of over a year or two. And that's where I look at how can we even begin to tackle a problem when the modalities and treatments that we're using aren't really all that effective and haven't gotten any more effective. And then
that's very interesting because, you look at the amount of money that's spent on these treatments. I mean, you mentioned in your show that there's some of them are, especially when you have the private ones, they can be tens of thousands of dollars for an intensive treatment. And the relapse rate is, like you said, it's almost 90%. Yeah,
especially for like methamphetamine is like the worst. And there's so many problems that we're kind of running into. So when you're looking at the problem we have like with severe mental illness is that there's only really a couple different choices you have for like schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. You got mood stabilizers that people have for mood instability, bipolar, and that doesn't even really, I mean, it works, but it makes people feel like crap. So we haven't really advanced anything for severe mental illness. And so once again, you have all these severe problems that seem to be growing. And then you start throwing in the problem of autism, where we don't have any treatments for that. And not only do you have no treatments for that, you don't really have any treatment options unless you're extremely wealthy. So it's just, as an industry, we got a lot of problems and no one's willing to talk about it. I think, I don't know how many people I had on Twitter and LinkedIn messaging me and basically quietly telling me, like, they weren't liking my posts or anything, but then they were messaging me going, dude, you totally nailed it. I could not agree anymore. That's where we're at, because a lot of people are working for the facilities. A lot of people are working for insurance companies. No one wants to come out and basically call a spade a spade. Even this hesitancy to call out our industry for basically sucking. I have no shame in admitting going, our treatments suck. I mean, yeah, it's the best of what's around and it's still better than nothing. How can we make our treatments better when we're kind of like patting ourselves on the back for failing 85, 90% of the time and then charging more for it? And then we come up with like, oh, we have equine therapy. We're doing art therapy. We're going to do this. And it's like, it's all variations of something that you're just adding money to.
Yeah.
And we're still not getting any better at it. I mean, it's just asinine to me.
So why do you think that is? I mean, is it because that there's a third party overpayment, or is it? I mean, I think on some level it's because we're very compassionate people by our nature, and so you do whatever you can, even though it may not be that effective, right? It's sort of like the person with terminal cancer; they're willing to do anything they can, even if there's like a 0.1% chance of a cure rate, right? They're willing to take a shot because they got nothing else to do, and there's no other better options. I mean, where do you think the problem lies? I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, part of it is in the industry itself, in not being forthcoming, I guess, about the rates of cure.
Honestly, I think I don't know. I think it's a lot of different things. I think first and foremost, you have to look at psychology. We're kind of like the redheaded stepchild. Not to offend any redheaded stepchild out there, but I'm saying
I have a lot of listeners. Yeah,
we have like the redheaded stepchild of the treatment, of health and wellness. For so long, we wanted to be taken seriously. I mean, the whole reason why we have a DSM manual in this medical model of psychology is that we wanted to be taken seriously by the doctors, the medical industry. And so part of me feels as though it's kind of like we're just now starting to get to a point where people are taking us seriously and maybe looking at us as quasi equals in the medical industry. And so I think if we were to sit there and basically say, so it took forever for you guys to actually, look at us with respect. And then now we're going to admit that a lot of what we're doing doesn't work. I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that even though it's not working, if we were to admit that maybe it's not working, it would make people seek treatment out less. And so I think there's that hesitancy to acknowledge it for that very reason. And then I think 3, it's almost like we don't really know what to do. If you really look at me as a doctor, you understand. I mean, the one area that we're really lagging behind is in neuroscience. Mm-hmm. And I think we're at a place where we're therapy and a lot of techniques is almost like trying to take advantage of neuroplasticity, but kind of like manipulating it from the outside. You can only get so much movement with it. Or as I say, some problems are hardware, like the brain. Some problems are like software, the coding, we write. And I think it's just that we're so far away. Like, it's like we've grown really far. And maybe our understanding, like with autism, for instance, I remember, I started working with autistic children about 2000 when I was an undergrad. And in my first year of grad school in 2003, for psychopathology, I wrote writing a research paper on the neurophysiology of autism. And back then, you couldn't find a study that could isolate one part of the brain. MRI study, CT study. Autopsy studies, really trying to get in there and understand it. And, maybe you have 10 patients that have an enlarged amygdala. You have 10 patients that have a smaller, you have 10 that have a normal. It was all over the place, right? But then through, as we've gotten more advanced with functional imaging, now we've mapped the entire brain, and what we've seen, it's a whole brain dysfunction. It's not just one part of the brain, it's the entire brain. They have 3 to 4 times more synaptic connections than people who aren't in the spectrum. They have far fewer mirror neurons in their brain. So it's like we have an understanding, but then what do we do with it? I don't know. At least we know what's causing it, but we don't have a lot of good treatments for it. Just like with schizophrenia, we really kind of isolated it. It almost has a similar mechanism as Alzheimer's. It's not the amyloid protein buildup, but it's very similar kind of protein tangles in the brain. Mm-hmm. So we kind of know, all right, once again, we know there's a genetic component, but then we also kind of know, all right, from a neurophysiology, but then what do we do with it? Yeah. And that's a big problem that we're running into. That's why I think we're stagnant, just like with addiction. We're stagnant because our understanding only goes so far, I think. Yeah.
Fundamentally, when you look at most functions within the body, you have a pretty good understanding for the biochemical markers and the functions and the way things work. When it comes to the brain, it is really just a complete black box. I mean, we know about the structures that are there and present, but we don't know how they interact with each other. We don't know how learning forms. I mean, we can have ideas where it starts. We can have basic ideas of what functions of the brain does certain things based on people who have infarcts or parts of their brain that are no longer functioning. And you wonder, certainly things like autism and dementia, a lot of these diseases are probably functions of multiple diseases, like they're 10 or 12 or so, but we don't have the sophistication to narrow them down to their own separate diagnoses, which makes treatment really random. It works for, sometimes this works in Alzheimer's and sometimes it doesn't. Well, it could be entirely because there are 3 different types of, variants of Alzheimer's disease. Likewise, it's probably the same in autism too, I would suspect.
You nailed it. I mean, heck, you got to look up until like 10 years ago. We were calling it 5 different things. There was pervasive developmental disorder, right, autism, Asperger's. A lot of us even it's called schizotypal. We had all these different names, and now we're kind of realizing a lot of it is probably all one part of the same kind of syndrome. But yet, you're absolutely right. It could be a syndrome of multiple different things. And so I do think with quantum computing and AI, I think we're going to start getting, a lot better with it. It's just, I think we're at a limit right now. It's just like with weather. We have an idea of what's happening with the weather, but it's just so much sheer data and knowledge and so much the models, just you need that computing power. And so I'm hoping we'll have some nice breakthroughs in the next 5 to 10 years, but we're a long ways off. And it was an interesting story. I don't know if I told you this, but this was, maybe like, almost, 5-6 years ago. And, when I was in practice with a partner of mine, a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and I was reading some studies done by Duke, and they're doing in vivo neurobiofeedback basically with addiction. Mm-hmm. So what they were doing, they were hooking people up to a functional MRI and people that were in treatment. And so first they kind of mapped their brain. So they kind of just did a resting kind of scan. And then they had it where they purposely triggered them. They showed them pictures of images that are associated with using. And then they had them start practicing the skill sets like mindfulness and meditation, mm-hmm, and just cognitive therapies. And so then they hooked it up to like this little slider bar. And so in the moment they were triggering them. And so if the brain was thinking that pattern that was more associated with addictive thinking, would go to the left. It was more associated with healthy thinking, it was to the right. And so then they were literally actively using their brain and using their skills to keep it in that sober place. So it was almost like mental exercise. Mm-hmm. And I remember I wanted to do that. My dad was a chief resource officer, and he hooked us up with some people that would actually maybe be able to get us a cheaper functional MRI.
Those exist?
Yeah. It was actually nice. It was like a hospital went out of business, and it was like, it was actually really good, and I remember we were talking about it, and I remember, the doc that I was working with, he goes, "You know what, Mike, research is cool and all, man, but there's just no money in research." Yeah. And that, you mentioned, what's the financial business model that's contributing to it, and that's it right there. The universities are so locked into the research that they're doing, it almost doesn't even really apply to the real world. I think functional neuroimaging, yes, but there's this disconnect I find. That's one of the reasons why I left my PhD in my 5th year. I always joke around, I have the most expensive master's degree of all time. But one of the reasons I left is because we're not applying any of this research. For being scientist practitioners, we're doing a crap job. So academia isn't doing the greatest job of applying it to the real world. We have private practice and industry doesn't really make any money doing any research. You have people that are completely gaming wealthy people like Daniel Amen and all these people like with chelation treatments and using functional neuroimaging with autism. It's like, and it's just a big what show basically. Yeah, right. And it's a perfect combination of like nothing really improves, and it's just sad.
It's interesting because when you look at academia and let's say the practice of whatever it is, and we'll just say in this case clinical psychology, it without a doubt, if you get far enough away from the actual practice, your ability to know what questions to answer are really limited. It's very challenging. I see this in anesthesia. I think it's probably in every field, that if you're not the one practicing much, you really don't even know what questions to ask, and ones that might be applicable. Absolutely, if someone figured out the solution, they make $1 gazillion, right?
Yeah.
Of course, you got to try and figure out how to get there.
Well, and that's where I think it's really tough, like especially like in areas like with autism. Your parents are so desperate
Oh,
for
sure. Yeah.
anything, right? And so then people are taking advantage of it, and using technologies, saying things, making claims that really you can't prove it all. And then it gives everything a bad name. I mean, hell, look at where we're at with anti-vaxxers. Utah, literally, I got into an argument with somebody online. Okay.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and so I think it's like I try to stay engaged with people, and so someone made this comment. I posted some research article, and then they made the comment like, well, oh, my daughter wasn't born with it, she, I was like, oh, mother of God, here we go.
Yeah.
And so I was like, all right, I'm going to engage this, because these anti-vaxxers, I haven't really had much interaction kind of with them. So I was like, all right, let's see where this goes, right? So,
I can tell you where it's going to go, but go ahead and go for your story.
Oh, so the thing is, like, what's amazing is that they have no understanding of research methodology. So they're reading abstracts and grabbing onto like one thing, and so they use this research, right, about this. I can't remember that mercury.
Yeah, thimerosal
preservative. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, look at this. Like it was a statistically significant increase when they used it versus didn't use it.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, yeah, but let's look at the methodology and the research here. So it was like 7 million people, the N of 7 million, we had exactly 134 diagnosed with autism versus it was like 76 or something,
right?
With the control. I go, if that was causing it wouldn't be 0.001% occurrence. It would be like 1 to 1.
Yeah.
And people don't understand that. And literally, when I'm going, I've been studying this longer than your daughter has been alive. I have multiple degrees. And you're telling me I am wrong. I go, there's something inherently wrong with that. You know what this person's answer was? Well, I'm in medical school.
Oh.
One, they weren't in medical school. They're
pre-med.
And I go, and so my response was, I go, well, I look forward to reading your research. My email address, my Facebook and my Twitter. I want you to forward over your research paper when you write it, and I look forward to having you on my show. And that's where I ended it.
Totally unimportant, but an important thing statistically. If you get a sample size large enough, you can prove about anything. But it will be statistically insignificant and useless information oftentimes. So,
and that's the problem with mental health, is that this is the type of stuff that's going on out there. And so how can we possibly have a discussion about what we need to do differently and better when we have so much crap going on out there, so much misinformation, so much skewed information, but here's where it gets interesting, though. When we look at treatments and where we should be going, it's interesting. Like in London, they were doing research with psilocybin mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, and so they took a clinical population there, people who are floridly suicidal, like people have basically been hospitalized for years. Because of just, awful, horrible, persistent depression. Yeah. And literally within, I think a day or two of receiving treatment, all their suicidality was gone. They, for the very first times in their lives, were being happier. They had different insights into things. And even, I think it was even like 6 months after they used it, there was a huge, it was like 60 or 70% reported lasting changes. And so there's been this big, push lately to maybe start looking at this. And why they're making that big push now? The pharmaceutical companies have identified what the accesses are. They believe with mushrooms it's glutamate. And so mysteriously, what do you think all the next class of antidepressants is going to be?
Yeah, right.
Glutamate. And so it's interesting how all of a sudden, mysteriously, they're taking some of these other things serious now that they know they can make some money on it.
Well, I guess ultimately it doesn't matter as long as people are getting better, but it's just like we're talking about the autism. As soon as you get close to a cure, well, then everyone's going to jump on board because they're trying to get their treatment or their modality or their medication out there because, that's where the money is, right? When you actually have something tangible. when it comes to the mental health, there are always these complaints about not enough access to mental health, and I feel like they're generally talking. And we say it's the general, the public or the people on TV or the health policy wonks or legislators, and they always say, well, there aren't enough beds, there's not enough, there are not enough personnel. I feel like the same thing is said in medicine too, when I think there's no shortage of, facilities and things that are available to people. They're just not utilized properly. Is it sort of the same in mental health? Is there stuff there, or it's just used improperly, or the people who not locked up, but put in inpatient situations for far longer than they should be?
So it all depends how much money you have, Eric. That's the reality. Is it all is depending on how much money you have. If you are wealthy, you can find a 45 to 60 day residential treatment program, no questions asked. You can get relatively decent treatment. The best that it's going to get. So if you have money, yeah. If you don't have money, that's where you start running into problems.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, let's say you want to use insurance for treatment. So the insurance companies realize that, okay, so we're losing money when people have to keep going to the ER for overdoses. Because typically when they're looking at a lot of the treatments, it's, all right, let's see if we can get them in 3 to 5 days and detox them, and then we'll put them in IOP. Now, mind you, that 3 to 5 day detox, you're not going to see any therapist. You're going to do basically group therapy, which is basically AA. And you maybe will see a psychiatrist a couple times. And then they'll release you off to an IOP program. Then if you keep messing up, then the insurance comes around, all right, crap. Now we're losing lots of money because 3 to 5 days. So what can we get away with? Well, we don't want to pay for 45. We don't want to pay for 60. The research clearly shows 45 days is like the length of residential treatment where it starts being really effective. 60 is perfect. Anything more than that is awesome, but you have to be rich to afford that. Right. So they go, all right, let's do 30 days. No one says 30 days is it's even good, but they go, all right, what's the minimum that we're willing to pay? We'll fund research that shows that 30 works. And so they settle at that. But you have to go through so many hoops just to get that. You have to fail at so many lower levels of care. Now, here's where the kicker comes in. If you have chronic long-term mental illness, not chemical dependency, this is where you're SOL.
Yeah.
You get 3 to 5 day med stabilization. So schizophrenia, bipolar, they'll stabilize you with meds. Once again, same deal. Won't see a counselor. We'll do group, and they'll just kind of med you up, charge you about 10, 15 grand. And then release you to the wild. And then maybe you'll get an outpatient provider where the same basic thing that got you in there to begin with will happen again. You want to do long-term residential treatment, you ain't going to have insurance paying for it. There's literally no such thing really as long-term residential mental health treatment. Unless you're rich. Then you're good. If you're good, you got that. When you're talking about what's the access to care there, it's once again, it's tiered.
Yeah.
You could be like state sponsored. There's a state mental hospitals, but it's you don't want to go there.
What you'd expect.
Really, really, really bad shape to get into a state mental hospital.
Do you think insurance is the way to practice? I don't know what you do in your practice, your private practice, but is insurance the right model for treating mental health?
No, I don't take insurance because one, they don't pay me anything. So I charge, $150 an hour. Dude, I charge $150 an hour. They'll charge me 50. And then literally they're going to make me jump through every hoop. I got to do my notes a certain way.
Yep.
I got to call them and do pre-authorizations. It's a big pain in the butt. And even then they'll kind of give you hassles with your check. Right. So that's why with me, I do out of network billing forms and I do a sliding scale. So, it's one of those things, for the full rate, great, awesome. If not, I'll have a sliding scale between 50 and 130, and I'll work with you as much as I can. So I try to really work with people. It's just the insurance model with mental health is just so flawed on so many levels, and then everyone's trying to game everybody.
Yeah.
Literally. I remember the games that we would play to get things approved. I remember one time. Yeah, we had a, because with with opiate addiction, you don't have to get them detoxed. It sucks. You're not going to die unless you have like a heart condition or strokes. You'd play these games of, all right, so what can we do here? Because literally, I would walk into my shift and intake when I was an intern, and you'd have the director of intake going, all right, well, we have 8 beds open. We got to fill this up. So right after the bat, you're kind of going, all right, well, we got to fill these beds up, right? And so literally, there was one day where the director was sitting there and just kind of like badgering us. What are you guys going to do? And now, mind you, this director wasn't a clinician; they were just a business person. Yeah. And I remember I had a Sharpie in my hand, and I was at the board. I chucked it across the room and walked out. I literally, and I was just like, "What am I?" I was like, "There's no like. It's not like my wife is a nurse. It was a stop the line or hold the line where you can basically clear safe harbor. We don't have that in our field."
Yeah.
So I walked back in there and just kind of started getting back to work. And literally it was like, well, okay, so yeah, they're detoxing from opiates. And then they're going, okay, well, they have a heart condition. They have high blood pressure, because that would then make criteria where they need to be medically detoxed.
Right.
Or it will be, well, if they say if they don't get treatment, they'll commit suicide. Well, now it's both. Now it's CD and mental health. Now we can get them in. And so those are the games that they would play. And then the insurance companies are going, well, we don't want to approve that. Why don't you guys try doing this? It's like, dude, they literally tried committing suicide like 3 days ago, and you're saying that they're fine? Well, they're not showing any active symptoms. I go, they were literally in the hospital 3 days ago from trying to take a bunch of Tylenol. Like, would you be okay 3 days later after that? I've had hangovers that last longer than 3 days. So, I mean, that's the game. And who's at fault? I don't know. They're all trying to game each other. So I think they're all just trying to make a buck and try to keep each other in line. But it's if people weren't trying to profiteer so much off of it, I think maybe that would maybe make the model a little bit better. But it's just really messed up, man. It really, really is. And it's sad because I love this industry. I've made my living in it. I believe a lot in what we're doing. It's just tough when there's so much fraud, so much waste, so much profiteering, and it's just wrong. It really, really is.
Well, it's not any different medicine. I mean, I think fundamentally it's the same, right? You have the consumers, the patient, who wants everything they possibly can get, and they work as hard as they can to get as much as they can. I mean, they don't try to be sick, but you're going to want the best of everything if it doesn't cost you anything. The people who are selling to you are more than happy to give you all that stuff. It's a person in the middle whose payment is like, whoa, I'm not going to pay anything, right? And so you have all these battles going on where you don't have any sort of, no one recognizes the true scarcity of the situation. And so it sounds like it's no different for you guys.
It really isn't. I mean, and the thing is, it's like you need a free market kind of system to push innovation. And I think we see it a lot more on the medical side, but I think there isn't any there's no motivation for innovation, because this might sound awful. This might not be true. I mean, I can't, I'm not sitting in those board meetings, but there's almost a part of me going, it works against their bottom line to make things better. It almost, when you have a revolving door of people constantly coming in, it almost is better for business to keep it this way. It doesn't make a lot of sense to basically call yourself out in your industry and then also then invest money to innovate it. That's what it almost seems like. And then academia, I think, isn't doing their job at all. I mean, what it's like in grant dollars, how hard it is. You just see some of the research that's coming out. It's like Captain Obvious research. It's like, why do you have to do research on that? I could have told you that without even doing the research.
Well, I mean, when you look at throughout history and you look at new innovations and disruptions in markets, it never comes from people who are within the market, who are market leaders. No. It's always going to be the upstart, the person on the outside, the person who can't get access to things, who has an idea or some sort of, whatever innovation that totally transforms the market. And at that point, it doesn't matter what the market does because it'll lose, right? I mean, that outside of trying to legislate from a licensing standpoint or something like that, they cannot stop those innovations from coming. Because, especially when you have such poor success rates, as you mentioned in some of your treatment programs within mental health. I mean, if you had something that was effective half the time, that'd be revolutionary, right?
Oh, without a doubt. And it would be so revolutionary. And I think, you nailed it yourself. It's going to be something outside, like outside factors that are going to disrupt it. But I think where I think the mental health industry, I think is maybe it's a different conceptualization of an outside disrupting factor, because if we're really being honest, I mean, with the exception of like autism, schizophrenia, bipolar, where it's structural genetics, right?
Sure.
I think the reality is that the majority of the mental health problems I think we're seeing is really more the downstream, collateral damage effect of just society in and of itself. And that's the reason why a lot of these things aren't working, is because we're I've always made the analogy of, I feel like I am treating soldiers for PTSD, where basically after we're done with the session, they go right back out into battle after I'm done with them.
Right.
And that basically my job is to make their emotional Kevlar better. But that's, to me, the dirty secret that no one really wants to admit, is that it's a symptom of society. I mean, if you really look at addiction, there's a reason why, the people that have been most persecuted, certain, cultures of people, that the addiction is higher in some than others. And so a lot of us have really kind of looked at addiction as it's almost like a coping strategy to deal with an environment they can't change. Depression, anxiety, it's a downstream effect, I think, of the world that we've created. I mean, we've trained kids to be consumers from the time they're 2 years old, to make it to where you need to buy something to feel different and better. And then we wonder, from a neuroplasticity perspective, that's going to affect their development to where nothing is going to make them happy. They're always looking for that next external hit of dopamine and norepinephrine to make them feel better. And I think that's the sad truth that no one really wants to admit. And I think, and we're looking at what's going to change it. It's going to take, I think, people waking up going, listen, like, maybe we need to change a little bit about what we do and how we do it. Can't be a sudden change. It can't be this huge, fast change, because, I mean, so much would have to change. But I think it begins with us maybe acknowledging the obvious.
Yeah.
That,
right.
And maybe it's a little controversial to say that, but I know it. To me, if you look at like Occam's razor, sometimes the most simple solution is the most likely, and that, to me, it seems like the most likely solution or likely explanation.
Well, the first thing is you have to recognize the problem, right? Is that every
absolutely,
concept,
yeah.
right?
And that's half the battle. Imagine society. I literally, like, one of the you and I were talking before the show about getting into radio and what made me do it. The biggest reason I actually maybe going to radio is when my second book I was working on, I wanted to call it Collateral Damage, where I was around the idea of we the people, we the problem. And my agent wasn't very enthusiastic about it. We weren't getting much from any publishers, and I kind of asked her, I go, this is, I think, the best proposal I've written. This is gonna be one of those books where I think this is gonna be something that makes me. She goes, listen, Michael, what you're saying is true. I'm not doubting that, but who the hell's going to want to read that? Who's going to want to read that? Hey, we're the problem society. We got to change.
Right,
and
right.
Pretty much every problem that we're complaining about. Michael, who's going to want to buy that book? And if no one wants to buy it, no one's going to want to publish it.
Yeah.
And I was dejected almost, like, oh, all right. So what do I do with this? And that's when I was like, you know what? Maybe podcasting and radio is the modality to get out there and do it. So yeah, that's kind of what brought me into it, actually.
The end run around the gatekeepers. So one final question for you.
Yeah.
Now, maybe two. So the first one is, how long have you been in practice again?
So I've been licensed for 11 years.
11 years.
Started seeing clients in 03, 04 in grad school. But actual post-licensure, 11 years. So
you've been treating people for a number of years now. How have the problems changed in your practice since you started? I mean, have you noticed a different sort of issues that are causing people to come in and get seen? I mean, expect in 10 years it actually wouldn't change much, but I suspect that's not the case.
That's actually a really good question.
I try and ask good questions, so good.
Oh yeah, man, that's an awesome question. All right. So there's been a couple changes. One, I don't think I have any problem throwing out there. Other one, I have to be careful how I craft it. So I think number one, the biggest I think shift that I've seen with anxiety and depression, especially on like college kids and adolescents, is there's a lot of very intelligent kids out there. I'm talking really intelligent, and they have a worldview. They kind of see things for what it is. I had a client the other day go, you have an idea what it's like being 14, and you see a bunch of people your age all doing stuff where you almost feel like you're watching Planet Earth. Hey, look at the bird puffing its feather up to get the mate, look cool,
Yeah.
And he goes, you see it for what it is, but then you also have then the reality of, okay, but I don't want to go through the next 4 years not having any friends. So what do I do with that? Or looking at their parents and their families and the people around them going, so you're telling me I need to go to school, do all these things to make money and make a living, but yet you guys are miserable. You're in debt. You're divorced. You guys hate each other. So why is it that I want to do this again? And kids are verbalizing, whereas before I think I more thought it, but they didn't have the words to describe it. Now kids are black and white. Like, yes, like I had a kid today where it's kind of what I suspect, and I don't like to lead them at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of, carefully craft some of my questions. And when I interpreted what he said, and it maybe put a little more panache on it, his eyes lit up. It was like somebody finally understood, and it's heartbreaking almost to see so many kids struggling through that. And so I think that's one big change that I've seen, which once again reiterates that viewpoint I have about society being a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Second one is, this is the one where, I always try to figure out how to word it. But you can always edit it out afterwards, but I don't think I'm going to say anything bad. But the male identity is non-existent anymore. That's one of the things I've seen with my male clients, especially the adolescents now, have really no coping strategies, no emotional fortitude or ego strength, as we call it. No real identity, really, because and that's something I see. It's very detrimental to young men, where the male identity has just almost been, it's been so, like that, what they call toxic masculinity,
disparaged.
And it's tough because I think men are really struggling, especially young men are really struggling to figure out what their identity is and what is okay. The very same things, like with my young daughter, we're trying to build up in her, almost seems the very things they're trying to vilify in men. And as a result, whereas in the past I saw, whenever you always hear the, oh God, what movie was it? Oh, we got Stage 5 clinger. Oh, it was Wedding Crashers, where it's like, oh, I'm trying to break up with this girl and they won't stop calling me. Now it's the opposite. Women are bad at, I don't know if I can swear, but women are awesome right now. I mean, they totally are strong and hungry, and they're not taking crap from anyone, which is exactly the way it should be. But our young men are struggling, and they're not doing well. And I worry about that, and I worry about the most is because the very things that we would want to tell them to kind of like make them stronger, it's almost wrong. They're not allowed to have that. And as a clinician, I even struggle with how to balance out society, my own views and values, and where things are heading. So, but that's a very disconcerting thing that I think a lot of people aren't talking about. And I think one of the big reasons why we're not talking about it is there's a reason, put it this way, most programs in psychology are going to be about, at least when I was going to school, it was like 2/3 females.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the research and a lot of the stuff coming out is, I think maybe the male identity has taken a hit at the expense, I think, of the feminine identity, which once again, females have earned the right to empower themselves. Like they absolutely should. I just worry that it's almost like it's come at the expense of the male identity. And I think we need to have a a course correction back to the Center for Men. Women, you guys keep doing everything you're doing. Once again, I want y'all to be better. But men, we got to figure out what we can do and how to have a discussion about male identity without coming across as misogynistic or wrong. So those are the two biggest shifts I've seen. And then I think the third one is just more incidences of autism. And addiction. Addiction just running rampant with everyone. Drugs, harder drugs starting earlier and earlier. Drug use starting earlier and earlier. That's a big one. Bullying has always been there and bad. It's just been maybe magnified by social media, making it, a little bit more, can't escape it pretty much.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. That, especially the second point there. It's one I'd never thought about. So that's someone to kind of chew about and ponder for a bit, I suppose. Well, our time is up, and I really appreciate you spending the time with me to go over the mental health industry and how it makes me feel a little better that I'm not the only one that's kind of messed up industry. So it's nice that you're just as bad as the healthcare industry. So congratulations.
Are we part of the club now?
You're part of the club.
Our official,
you might be worse. I mean, it's funny because you did mention early on, you said, you'd be, can you imagine medicine if there's 80%, if treatment is only 80% effective? I thought, boy, I bet oncologists would kill for that sort of effectiveness. But
I think
anyway,
it's awesome, man. I think it's great that, we're having this conversation, because I think, for far too long, I think our disciplines have been almost at odds, I think, with each other. And I think we're finally starting to get over that hump of we're all respecting one another. And I think it's good that we're having this conversation, because I think we're going to accomplish a lot more together. I think, especially with with drug addiction problems, because it's the Venn diagram of the overlap between the mental health and the medical. And so I think more of us need to be having this conversation, I think.
Boy, I feel like I need to just reach across and give you a virtual hug, but then that'd be
we can't.
a challenge to my male
hug
identity. So I don't know. Well, Mr. DeVine, where's a good place for people to follow more of your stuff besides subscribing to Gray Matters Radio?
So a couple of places. So you can get us graymattersradio.org. It's our website. It has all the blogs and articles on there. You can get us on Twitter, Gray Matters Radio, but it's RDIO. Facebook at Gray Matters Radio. You can also get me on my more counseling website, michaeldevinecounseling.com. So you can see who I am as a counselor, not just a radio personality. And then you can get me. So Gray Matters Radio, it's we're always on Mondays airing our podcast, and you can also catch me on the Voice of the Radical Center on Top 1370 and on pretty much radio.com, pretty much everywhere, on live Sundays at 2 to 3 o'clock Central Time, 3 to 4 Eastern Time.
Well, thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, man. It's real as always.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.